I've been working in Ableton for probably about 10, 11 years at this point. And over that time, I've kind of collected some of my favorite advanced Ableton tricks. And these are the ones that usually when I'm teaching students, I tell them about, and they're most often like, whoa, that's really mind-blowing or crazy, or I didn't know Ableton could do that. So here are 21 advanced Ableton tricks that I think are going to be really helpful for you in your process. Let's start off with one of my favorites. This is how to get kind of that exponential rhythm type sound that you hear in some tracks. You can do this with any synth or sampler. The main thing you need is the arpeggiator. Let's just grab a sampler for right now, make a MIDI note on C3, and throw, I don't know, some kind of a percussive sample into this. So I found this kind of tonal sample. If I turn the arpeggiator on, because there's no other notes, all you're going to get is this one sound repeating at whatever rate we've set this at. Currently it's at eighth notes. But if I turn this to milliseconds mode, now it's going to be triggering that note over and over again at whatever millisecond amount we have here. So you can go from really fast to really slow. Usually what I like to do is automate this. And we can do a little more here to make this sound cooler. I oftentimes like to also go in to the envelopes section on the clip and play around with the pitch bend on it. So I'll bend from high to low. Sometimes playing around with some filter automation can be really fun as well. We'll open the filter up as it goes with a bit of resonance too. And throw a little auto pan on there, why not? So there we go, that's one really fun sound design trick. Love using arpeggiator on non-synced mode. Another trick I like to use all the time is adding a groove to a hat or whatever you want in your project, not using the provided grooves that Ableton has, but instead extracting it from something else in your project. I've got this just really basic sounding hi-hat, doing eighth notes, but I've also got this little tambourine break, the famous Lynn Collins Think break. And it has a lot of swing and a lot of groove to it. I want to get my hi-hats to match what's happening there. So what I can do is right-click and choose Extract Grooves, which is going to be right here. It'll think for a second. It's going to extract the groove and put it over here in the sidebar. Now, I can double-click this, and I can choose the Lynn Collins Think break as my groove, set the bass to eighth notes, and there we go. Now my hi-hat pattern matches the groove of the think break. Up next, I want to show you a way where you can copy a particular parameter change across everything that you have inside an instrument rack or a sampler. Let's just say I would like to tune my entire kit up higher. Well, what I can do is go into the controls, turn the transpose up on one of these. So right now I'm working with the bass drum, which means this bass drum is now going to be 7 semitones higher. Right click, choose copy value to siblings. And what that's going to do is it's going to copy it across all of the other instruments in this drum rack. So you can see the snare, 7 semitones, and the closed hi-hat, 7 semitones. I'm going to undo that and show one other feature. Maybe we want to add a filter that is being modulated by an LFO. So right-click LFO, copy value to siblings, right-click the turning the filter on and off, copy value to siblings. What we're doing here is just making sure that I don't have to go through and turn these filters on for every single one of these drum hits here. All I have to do is do it one time, copy it across all the others. And if we look in here, we can see this LFO is not applied to the filter on any of these drum hits. It's always at 0 for all of them. But the moment I make a change on one and choose copy value to siblings, now all of them are going to be applied at the same amount. And so now we get this really kind of wonky, weird LFO-y filter. I also want to change where the frequency is and the resonance, and we'll turn up the amount of the filter. And maybe not so much in theirs. Here's a quick one that's very useful and plays on sort of a psychoacoustic effect that helps us tell what direction a sound is coming from. So the way that we can tell a sound is coming from our left or right is by the timing differences between when the sound hits one ear versus the other. Your brain can decode those very small differences. So we can actually trick the brain into thinking a sound is wider by delaying one side of the signal a little bit. For this, I like to use the align delay device. So normally this sample sounds like this.
We live in life.
Fairly mono right in the middle, might be perfectly mono actually. But if you set the left or right side to something different than the other, but like a very small amount, it'll have the effect of making this feel very wide.
We live in life. We in the basement. It's a new day. Not by the way.
This is what's known as the Haas effect, and I use this quite often for making a sound much wider than it needs to be. Sometimes I have to rein it in a little bit so it's not just like too wide, but it's good for pushing things out of the center image if you want to have some other sound in the center taking up the focus. Up next, I want to show you how to create a duct reverb. Now, oftentimes when you're applying reverb to dry vocals like this acapella I grabbed, it can kind of get in the way of the vocals a bit and blur the word, make it a little difficult to understand.
We live in life. We in the basement.
One thing we can do to fix this is to duct the reverb with a sidechain compressor. In order to do this, what we have to do is click the reverb, press Command G to put it into a group, then click this little button over here in the left side and choose Create Chain. All you have to do is right click in this area and Create Chain comes up as an option. I'm going to press Command R, rename this one Dry, and on the top one, I'm going to turn the reverb to 100% wet. So now I have a fully wet signal on this top chain and a fully dry signal down here.
We live in life.
What this allows me to do is add processing to the reverb and leave the dry signal alone. Let's grab a compressor like we would add to any other sidechain situation. Turn off makeup gain, open up the sidechain, turn on external sidechain input, and what we're going to do is set the source to the same channel that we're currently working with. So source is 21, and I would like to set this to either pre-effects, or I could just go and set this directly to the dry chain right here, knowing that the dry chain is always going to have just the dry signal coming through. So now this reverb is being ducked by the dry sound. All we have to do is adjust the settings and dial it in exactly as we want it.
We live in life. We in the basement. It's a new day.
Now, obviously, I'm digging in a bit deeper than I probably would in a normal situation just to prove the point and show it to you, but that's how you get that to work. Normally, I'd probably dial in just a little bit, just to let the vocals sit on top of that reverb, then allow the reverb to kind of fully open up once the vocals are done.
We live in life. We in the basement. It's a new day.
Next, we're going to talk about how to create a frequency split rack. Sometimes you want to be able to process the top frequencies in your sound differently than the lower frequencies. One really good example for that is when you have a bass. So sometimes I want to add a lot of grit and distortion to a bass, but I do not want it to ruin the sub, because adding distortion to a bass can sometimes affect the low end in a negative way. What I've got here is just a fairly clean basic 808 type sound. I'm going to add an amp to this. And we can hear right away, if you're on good speakers, you should be able to tell that this has kind of brought the low frequencies down a bit. I'm going to use a spectrum to prove that. Here it is before. You know, nice fat sub, turn the amp on. It's really just lowered that sub volume. So I want to keep my sub clean, but I still want to get that grit that I'm getting from the amp. Now, there's a pretty easy way to do this. So we'll put the amp aside for now. Grab yourself an EQ8, set it to a high pass times 4, and set the frequency to, I usually do 100 hertz. You can kind of put it wherever. It doesn't matter based on the way we're setting it up, because you'll be able to change this later. So after you've made your 100 hertz high pass, group the EQ by pressing Command G, and then duplicate the chain by pressing Command D. So now we have two parallel chains that are identical. On the low one, you're going to now turn the high pass into a low pass. Call this one high. Call this one low. And so now I can process the top end differently than the low end. So I could take this amp, put it on the high chain. In this situation, I'm going to want to put the amp in front of the filter. That way I'm sending the full signal, including the sub, through the amp and then cutting the lows out. It's going to be a bit of a different sound if you put it after. I'll show you what I mean by that. But take a look at how this now has changed our sub response. We still get that nice fat sub, but we also get the upper end tone. Now check it out. If I were to put this amp after the low cut, high pass, whatever you want to call it, the sound's very different. That's because this amp is a distortion unit, and the distortion unit really depends on the low frequencies pushing through, combining with the top ones to create the sort of tone you want. I'm not saying it's wrong or right, I'm just saying it's a different sound, so you should give it a shot and see what you think. This also allows you to come in here, put a little extra processing on the lows, keep those separate from the highs. Like if I want to add some saturation to the lows to create some more upper harmonics, I'm going to want to put that after the EQ8, because there's really not much point in me saturating the lows and then cutting all those harmonics I create out. I'm going to put it after, saturate them. Let's solo just that chain to hear it. And there we have it. I've now added upper harmonics. We can see those here. Those didn't exist before. If I put this in front of the EQ8, it doesn't really make much of a difference at all. So in this situation, I for sure would put the saturator after, combine these together, and we get a really lovely high-low processing split to create a really fat, gnarly bass. Now, in the same vein as creating a frequency split rack, we can also create a mid-side split rack. The mid signal is any sound that is identical in both speakers. It's going to come through as kind of a center image sound, whereas the side signal is anything that is different in both speakers. And you can actually create your own decoder to process the sideband independently from the midband. So let's say, for example, what I did here was I added a chorus after my amp to give the top end of this sound a little bit of width. But I want to do a little work on the wide signal so it's not quite as aggressive. How you do that is you grab a utility, right-click the width knob, and choose mid-side mode from the top of the menu that appears. I'm going to group this like I did that EQ and duplicate it again. On the top one, I'll set this to side. On the bottom, I'll set it to mid. If I solo just the side chain, all I'm hearing is everything that has stereo width, which is a little bit weird sounding, but you can get in here and process this, or you could maybe make it a bit less wide or something. Turn the gain up on it. Add some distortion to just the sides. Why not? Let's recombine that with the mid signal. And we can now use the volume on this chain to blend in how much of that side we want. Here's another really good trick, and that is using the mid-side mode on EQ8. So EQ8 normally operates in stereo mode, meaning each of these bands is going to affect the stereo image equally, but you can actually set the mode to M/S. And now the edit turns into an M or an S, which stands for mid or side. So I can actually come in here and edit just the side signal separately from the mids. Like if I didn't want all of the lows I'm getting from my sides, I can go ahead and turn on a high pass, get rid of some of that, maybe give it a little boost up here, add some more crispiness into the sideband, and then I can come over here and adjust the mids independently as well. Maybe I need more from the upper end of my mids, so I'll add a bit of a shelf and a peak right here around 10K. If you're finding any of these tips useful, then I highly recommend you go and check out EDMProd.com. There's a whole free download section there. One of the things in particular that might be most helpful is the Ableton Workflow Bible. This is just completely full of lots of cool tips and tricks that experts have been using in Ableton for years. We've also got a music production software guide, a whole resource list, all of these and tons more free resources. Link to EDMProd is in the description of this video. Go check it out. I do a lot of mid-side processing in my tracks, and I find it very helpful for getting a nice locked-in mix. Sometimes you can get some pretty cool tonality by just really pushing the sideband in ways that are a little unexpected. And once you've created your mid-side rack, I highly recommend you save this because you can end up using this for a lot of situations. For example, sideband compression, which is my next tip I want to talk about. So I've taken this drum break and I've made it too wide. This is a very dynamic signal, which means I might actually want to use a compressor to deal with these sideband dynamics. Certain third-party plugins have the ability to just compress the sideband like FabFilter, but Ableton's compressors don't have this yet, so you have to use one of these mid-side decoders in order to get at the sideband. I'm going to grab a glue compressor, put it after the utility on my mid-side rack, and now this glue compressor is only working on the stereo width of the signal. And by compressing this, I can actually turn down the stereo width in a dynamic way. If I dial it in pretty aggressively, you'll hear the sound becomes much more mono. So if you've got a sound that's just like popping up on the width of your mix, or a certain sound's just back and forth and it's very quick and very dynamic, maybe a mid-side EQ isn't the move, and instead you want to use one of these sideband compressors. Here is one of my favorite tricks that was just introduced in Live 12. It's the similar sample search function. Of course, you can come over here and say, all right, I would like a bass sound. This one's neat. Maybe I'm going to use the similar search here in the browser. And it's going to give me all of the samples that are similar to that sound based on my browser. But the way that I've been using it lately that is most helpful, I think, is by grabbing a sound out of a track that I really like and finding something similar to that. I'm going to use a track that I dropped recently so that I don't get any kind of copyright strike of any sort here. All right, so this is a little hand crushed by a mallet flip that I just released. And what I want to do is find an isolated snare and try to use that snare to find another one like it in my library. Now, this one's pretty good. There's some other sounds happening on top of it. That's usually pretty much inevitable. But let's just go ahead and use it for the example. First of all, I'm going to isolate the sample. Trim it down a little bit. And I'm going to press Command J to consolidate it. That way it's just this one sound. If I right click, what I can do is go to Show Similar Files. Over here on the side, it's now going to look for any of the samples that are similar to this one snare that I extracted. Now we can do this with sounds that aren't percussion either, and you get some pretty interesting results. Let me just take one of the basses. Pretty aggressive bass. We'll consolidate it, right click, show similar files. Let's just see what we get. This is a really awesome way to search a large sample library that might be unorganized, somewhat like mine is. Doesn't really matter. I have other ways of searching through it, and this is one of them. Interesting. Let's go back to this 808 that I had earlier, and I want to show you a really great trick using one of my favorite devices in Ableton, and that is the envelope follower. I'm going to make this sound a bit more percussive by reducing the decay time on the amp envelope. That way the volume falls away a little bit, and this example is going to be a bit easier to hear. So we can use erosion to add some nice top-end hiss. But sometimes the issue is that erosion doesn't really feel like it's following the contour of the sound. So one of my solutions to this is to use the envelope follower device. Now what an envelope follower will do is it follows the volume of the sound that's coming through it, and you can use that volume level as a control source, as a modulation source. Let's set this to remote, map the amount, and check this out. This is the incoming volume, the incoming signal from this sound. I can add a little bit of rise and fall percentage, and so now what it will do is it will rise and fall more smoothly. And I can also turn the gain up. This is not actually going to turn the volume of the sound up. It's going to turn up the gain inside the envelope follower, but you're not going to hear a change. And now we can really hear the erosion follow along with the contour of the sound much, much better. I also use envelope follower to give my snares a little more punch and a little more spice. And I do that by pairing it with an EQ. Right now, my snare sounds like this. And what I want to do is actually pop the signal up a little bit, right in that very sensitive range of human hearing. But I don't want it to stay up there. I want it just like very quickly, momentarily go and just open up really quick. So I'm going to map this to the gain of this EQ number 4. And I'm going to set the range of it to 50 to 100% for right now. And check that out. We can see that when the snare happens, it pops that little part of the signal out and makes it much brighter, more in your face. Setting this from 50 to 100 means that it won't go down below 0. If I have this all the way down at 0, then it'll kind of give me a dip right there. And maybe I don't want it to go all the way up, so I can adjust the top end too to like 75, 74%. All right, so up next, I've got a really cool mix referencing technique. Again, I'm going to use one of my own songs just to avoid any issues on YouTube. There we go. Not saying this would be the mix reference I would choose for this, but it will be a nice back and forth to show you what I'm talking about. So usually I keep my reference tracks at the bottom. I'm just going to go ahead and group this, and I'm going to name this group mix refs. And then what I want to do next is turn both of these off. Now, the issue here is that I have processing on my master bus. I do not want to run my mix references through that processing. So what most people will do is they'll come in here and they'll set the output of the group or the channel to external out 1 and 2. Now what that does is it skips your master bus processing, but it also skips all of the meters and all the tools that I use during my mixdown. If I wanted to use all these tools, I would have to duplicate them on to the group or the track, and that's fine, but it is a little bit of an inconvenience. There is a better way though. Let's set this back to main and turn these both off again. Now what I'm going to do on my main is I'm going to grab any Ableton device that has a sidechain input, and I'm going to put it before all of my meters, but after any processing that I have on the master. I'll turn the dry wet all the way down so this is not a compressor anymore. Open up the sidechain and set the input source to be my mix refs group. You want to make sure that it's tapping the channel post effects, but not post mixer. Post effects means it'll be taking the audio before the mixer. Now, turning the channels on and off is part of the mixer process. That's what allows us to hear our track, but not hear the reference by turning that off. The last thing we need to do is turn on this little blue headphone icon right here. What this headphone icon does is let us listen to what is coming in through the sidechain source. Typically at this point, I'll enter key mapping mode, and I will map the on-off button on my glue compressor to whatever key I want. And now when I turn this channel on inside the group that is turned off, it will allow me to switch immediately back and forth between these two tracks. Let's start with the track that's not the reference, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn it on halfway through. An added benefit to this is that we're able to compare very, very quickly between two sounds that we hear back to back. If we leave even a few seconds of time in between when we hear one source versus the other, it makes it more difficult to compare those two sounds. So for me, this is just a very useful and helpful way to analyze and compare any of my music against reference tracks. One way that I like to create melodies is through what I kind of consider to be almost like collaboration with my computer. What I'll do is I'll write a few chords, and then once I have my chords, I'll add an arpeggiator in front of it and set the style to something like random once. That's usually my favorite. That'll like randomly play the notes and then keep repeating them. You could also just do random other or random as well. We'll stick with this for right now. So now I'm going to get like a random arpeggiation on all these notes. Now that's great, but as I'm writing a track, I want a little more consistency than that. So what I can do is create a MIDI track underneath it, set the input of the MIDI track to the operator track that we've been working with, turn on recording arm for the empty MIDI track, and now if I press record, it's going to record the arpeggiated output of these MIDI notes. And that allows me to get in here and make whatever edits I need and then reapply the edited arpeggiation to the original synth. Another tip involves this, and that would be using LFO to create some variation and more of a human feel in your sounds. So I'll grab LFO. In Ableton 12, they have some really nice new waveforms that are random, the stray and glider. Been loving those. I'll set this to stray, and I'm going to map it to the gate. The gate is how long the note is going to be. Let's just turn down the amount, kind of focus it a little bit more in the like lower to mid range, turn the rate down. I'm going to duplicate this and map this to something like the number of steps. So now it might go a little higher by a distance of 12 semitones. And I'm also going to set this to a monophonic synth with some glide in case the gate overlaps the notes. That way it'll kind of glide between them. And now we get this sort of a feel. A little too high. Let's go ahead and take the transposition down. Yeah, kind of neat. And now we'll set the input to come from operator and record the output. We can get some really cool experimental sounds out of this. Now this might just sound like complete randomness, right? Where this really starts to get interesting is when we add a rhythm, like a beat to this. Let's just find a break that's at 140, and then we'll make sure that we have this turned off and we don't have any inputs here. That way we are hearing only the MIDI that we recorded. Got a few more tricks for you. One of them involves sampler again. Sampler is for sure my desert island synth. There's a few things you can do with it that I think are just amazing. First of all, let's start with the FM in sampler. So what I've done is created just a basic sine wave. I'm going to drag and drop that into the sample section. So now we should just have a basic sine wave in sampler. And we do. But if you go over to the pitch oscillator tab here and turn on oscillator, what this gets you is an FM oscillator. And you can FM this sound to get more tones. If I turn up the volume, we're going to start to hear that. The coarse tuning will adjust the pitch of the modulator oscillator, and volume is how much of that modulation oscillator is being applied to the carrier, which is the sample in this situation. Where this starts to get really fun is when you involve the envelope. So you can have the envelope be pretty plucky, just to get like a little bit of that attack from the FM sound. But you can also loop this envelope. If you set this to beats mode on eighth notes, then it's going to loop every eighth note. I want to share with you my favorite drum processing trick. So right now I've got this drum pattern that, I mean, it's not unprocessed, but I think it could use a little more thump. So I think this drum pattern will work pretty well for what I want to do. The way that I like to process most of my drums on the bus, usually, in this case I'm just doing it on one channel because it's just a simple loop. But what I like to do is get a glue compressor. And I like to overcompress the crap out of it. So it'll sound bad, but you'll see how this works. Usually I put the attack all the way up and the release all the way down and the ratio all the way up. A slow attack means the front edge of the drums can pop through. A fast release means that when the sound goes below the threshold, it'll open back up very quickly and be ready to allow the next front edge of the sound through. And a high ratio just means very intense compression, and that's what I'm going for with this technique. I'm going to lower the threshold quite a bit until I start getting some pretty bad sounding compression, I'd say. Completely tank to the sound, then I turn the makeup gain up into the clipper that's on the glue compressor. So now we're getting a lot of the front edge of the sound. We're still losing, by comparison, much of the body. So what I do next is I lower the dry wet down to 0%. So now we're back to the original drum sound, and I feed the compressed signal in as a layer to the uncompressed signal. And I find that putting it somewhere in the middle gives me a really nice balance between knock and body on the drums. So without it, and with it. This is what's known as parallel compression or New York style compression. Love doing it with glue compressor though, because the built-in soft clipper lets you really drive that compressed signal very hard. My next trick with sampler, and this is why it's kind of my desert island synth, is that you can turn any sound into a synth. Let's just find some random sample, like whatever I come across first in here. Alright, so I found this drum loop. If I play it, it's just going to sound like a drum loop. Nothing crazy with that. But what you can do is actually get in here and start to loop little tiny bits of it to create tones. So I'll put the starting arrow right here. And I'm going to turn on the forward and forward sustain mode. This is the loop. Now we can adjust the loop start and end spots to find a very small section of the sample. Let's just go like right here. Boom, there we go. We've just created a synth. And if I move this over to anywhere else, I can get different tones. The smaller the loop, the higher the pitch. So once you figure out where you'd like to have this loop set, you have to tune the synth. Let me get a tuner. Maybe this will work. All right, so it's coming across as a B flat, A sharp, but I'm playing a C. So what I want to do is set the root to an A sharp. And now I'm playing a C, and the sound that I'm getting is a C. I can come in here and add some stereo width. Get a lot of like nice movement. I can go ahead and add that oscillator like we showed about earlier. Maybe we'll get a little motion in here with the looping envelope. And I can add some pitch envelope too. Let's go ahead and add a filter mostly for this drive circuit in it. And I've just created a really nice gnarly bass out of nothing but this teensy tiny little bit of signal. You can do anything with the sampler in Ableton. It's so cool. All right, I made a little melodic line out of this. Now let's just say I want to add some amp to this and apply the amp only at certain points of the sound. Like maybe I don't want it to happen right away. I want it to kind of like swell in so that each note gets this like grittiness as it plays through. Well, I could automate that in there, but the easier way to do that would be to use something like the Envelope MIDI device. Envelope MIDI will allow you to use the onset of MIDI notes as the trigger for a modulation envelope. So if I map this to the dry wet on this amp and I increase the attack time, every time a MIDI note hits over the next, like let's say 800 milliseconds or so, it will turn up the dry wet. Sometimes I can use this with like an EQ to get some cool harmonics out of the sound too. We're going to click this little button, which is going to show the other options. I can map this up to 8 different parameters. Let's map it to the gain of one of these. Set this to 50% like we did earlier on the snare, and we'll adjust the curvature so it attacks a bit faster, reaching its top a little bit quicker. And what I want to do is move the frequency around here to find some cool harmonics. Let's turn the scale up. Maybe we can try and put this in front of the amp. Neat. How about this one? Yeah, that one's cool. Let's turn the scale down a little bit. So there we go. Just a few different ways for you to use Envelope MIDI for sound design purposes. I mean, I use it for a lot of different things, but very cool for sound design. The final trick that I want to show you is how to create some space in your mix using multiband sidechaining. So I set up this little situation here where I have an acapella mixed with a pad. And my concern is that the pad is taking up too much room in the mix. It's covering up the vocals. I want to make sure that I can duck this pad out of the way, let the vocals sit in an area that I really would like them to pop through. I could just EQ the pad, but then that EQ is constant, right? And when the vocals aren't happening, then I have this big dip in a certain area of my pad. So what I do instead is I do multi-band sidechaining. And I do this with the multi-band dynamics. What you want to do is put your multi-band dynamics on the sound you'd like to duck out of the way. In this case, it's the pad. And I want to duck just a certain frequency range of the pad. For the vocals, I usually find the most important area to pop through is this region right between 1 and 5 or 6K.
I can't stop imagining what.
All of this stuff I would like to sit on top of the pad. So I'm going to go back over here and set the high-low frequency split to 6,000 hertz and 1,000 hertz. That means this mid-band will be focused in on just that area. And when I add sidechaining in to this one band, it'll duck only that frequency range. Open up sidechain, turn on external, set the source to the vocals. And now you can drag up and down the threshold using the upper end bar here.
I can't stop imagining what a life.
And let's go ahead and add a little bit of compression by clicking and dragging down.
I can't stop imagining what a life we could be having, and I can't really place it.
We can see and hear as the vocals are singing, it's ducking just that little frequency range, leaving the rest of the pad sound alone. It's much less noticeable than just cutting an EQ into that sound, and it only happens when the vocals are grabbing our attention anyway. There we have it. I hope you enjoyed all these advanced Ableton tips. Leave a comment if you have any questions.